Hello everyone, my name's Jess Huntley. I'm a mathematical research software engineer at STFC, and yeah, I'm going to be talking about tracking the carbon cost of software today, with a particular focus on some work that I did in adding an emissions table to a piece of software called Fit Benchmarking, which compares different optimization algorithms. So to start off with, I thought I'd just share a little bit about me. So my name's Jess. I studied maths at university. And then since graduating, I've worked at STFC, which stands for the Science and Technology Facilities Council, and is one of the research councils that makes up UK research and innovation. So the photo on the right of the slide shows an aerial photo of one of the STFC sites, which is where I work, and it's located just south of Oxford. So there's lots of big science that happens on site. Some of the big buildings that you can see are kind of particle accelerators and synchrotrons. So there's lots of scientists with a lot of data, and the group that I work in, which is the computational maths group, work on developing algorithms and software for large-scale computational problems. So in today's session, I'm going to talk first a bit about why we should be interested in tracking the carbon cost of software, and then how we can go about doing that. And then I'll go into a bit more detail about the work that I did with adding an emissions table to Fit Benchmarking, and then go over a few kind of example results and how it could potentially be useful for users going forward. So why should we be tracking software carbon emissions? Because, well, software on its own doesn't emit any carbon, but the hardware that we run it on uses electricity and consequently emits carbon. And the way that our software is designed and used can impact how energy intensive it is. And yeah, as it says on the slide, we're facing a climate emergency, which you're probably all very aware of. Climate change is a huge problem and is only getting worse. So we really should be doing what we can to try and reduce the carbon footprint of what we're doing, both in work and outside of work. The IT sector as a whole in 2020 was estimated to account for between 2 to 6% of global carbon emissions, and this is predicted to rise quite dramatically by 2030. And in fact, data centers alone emit a similar amount of carbon to American commercial aviation, so we're talking quite a lot of carbon emissions here. And currently, there's very limited information around the carbon cost of computational research. There's not really any standardized methods for measuring or reporting carbon cost. And so as research software engineers, it's important that we try and do what we can to understand the carbon costs of our own work. So how can you track carbon emissions in software? There's a few different approaches that you can take, and I've got some examples of those on the slide. And then I've got some kind of references slide at the end with links to these tools if you want to kind of have a look at them in any more detail. But yeah, so the first kind of way you can track carbon is using an online calculator. So I've got a screenshot from the Green Algorithms website on the slide. And with this, you can input details of your algorithm, like runtime and the hardware that you're running it on, and even like where you're located. And so you kind of input all of these details, and then you get a nice output showing you an estimated carbon footprint for running your piece of code, as well as a few things that that's equivalent to. So this is really nice because it's easy. Anyone can access the website and put in the details, and you can get an estimate before you've run the code and actually emitted the carbon, so you can kind of look at what changes you can make in order to make it more efficient. However, this isn't embedded into a software package, so you are relying on users or developers to kind of input all the details manually in order to kind of get an estimate. So another option is to use an embedded package, so something like CodeCarbon, which is a Python package, and this estimates or measures the hardware electricity consumption as you're running your code, so you can kind of get an immediate measurement and reporting on how much carbon has been used for a particular job. So this is great because you can just kind of add it into your software, and users then have the option to run the carbon emissions tracking. However, it does require a bit of work on the software engineer's part to add it to the code, and also it's not independent of programming language. So CodeCarbon can be used for Python, but other programming languages would need a different tool. So the final option is a server-side tool like Green Algorithms for HPC. So this can be installed on a HPC cluster and then kind of pulls information that's logged when different jobs are run. So again, this is kind of good because it gives an accurate measurement and it's independent of programming language. But if you're running something locally, then it's not an option. So now we've had a look at why you want to track carbon emissions and how you can do that. I'll talk a little bit about fit benchmarking, which is a software package that's developed and maintained by a small team at STFC. So it's an open source Python package and was developed to compare different nonlinear least squares solvers and how they perform on different fitting problems. So to kind of try and explain what all of those words actually mean, I thought I would show like a example workflow in pictures, and I promise I won't share any kind of maths equations. We'll kind of treat that as a magic black box for this, the purposes of this talk. So if you're a scientist working on a beamline, for example, you might get some data that looks a bit like what's plotted in the black crosses. And then you might want to kind of fit a mathematical model to this data to better kind of understand the features and what you're seeing. So mathematical models are dependent on a number of different parameters, and so you might want to try and run a fit to get the best parameters. And so that an initial starting guess is shown by the pink line on this plot. So then in fit benchmarking, you can, there are a number of different minimizers that you can choose from, which are essentially different optimization algorithms and different implementations of those. And the problem is cast as a nonlinear least squares fitting problem, and then fit benchmarking spits out a lot of results. So if you run with one minimizer, you might get a fit that looks a bit like this blue line, when you can see that captures the peaks in the data pretty well, and so you'd be quite happy with that. But if you run on a different minimizer, you might get something like this green line, which you can see doesn't capture that second peak. And so yeah, it's very easy to look at these two plots and immediately see which is better. But scientists have large volumes of data, and so we need a way to algorithmically determine which is the best minimizer to use, rather than just relying on sort of looking at it by eye. So fit benchmarking will run a lot of different fits for various fitting problems, and then produces results tables for the users. And so before this piece of work, the two main metrics that we used to compare different minimizers were runtime and accuracy. And so I've just put a small kind of snapshot of an example runtime table on the slide. And the idea is that you can quite easily pick out which minimizers are performing well for your problems. So each of the rows in the table is a different problem, and each of the columns represents a different minimizer. So for example, if you're interested in getting something that runs really quickly, you might discount CG as a minimizer for this problem set, because it is running quite slowly compared to the other ones. So yeah, the piece of work that I did was to add another table like this, but instead of showing runtime or accuracy, it shows estimated carbon emissions for running that fit. So to do this, I chose to use the CodeCarbon Python package in order to embed the emissions tracking into fit benchmarking. And fit benchmarking has a lot of different stages to it, so it passes in a problem set and then runs the fit and then produces the results tables. But I wanted to isolate the emissions tracking only to the call to each time the fitting function is called. So to do this, in CodeCarbon, you can create an emissions tracking object, and then you choose when you start and stop the emissions tracking. And this was great in theory, but when we first started looking at CodeCarbon, you could only start and stop the emissions tracking object once. So this meant that for every fit that fit benchmarking was running, you had to produce another emissions tracking object, which took kind of a couple of seconds to do. And I mean, if we go back to the runtime table, like for this set of problems, most of the fits are taking a fraction of a second. So if you add another couple of seconds to each of those, then you can see that it very quickly becomes very unsustainable and sort of does more harm than good. So yeah, that was painfully slow to run, but fortunately Code Carbon then introduced a feature where you can use the same emissions tracking object to measure the emissions for different tasks. So we managed to get around that issue, which was fortunate. There are a couple of other kind of implementation pitfalls that we found when looking at Code Carbon. So for Windows, in order to obtain an accurate measurement of kind of power consumption, Code Carbon relies on a tool called the Intel Power Gadget, which is now deprecated and not available for new users. And on Linux, root access is required to change permissions of files that contain power consumption data. So again, that's not ideal because it's not going to be available to all of the fit benchmarking users. And Code Carbon has a fallback mode if these kind of more accurate approaches aren't available to it, which estimates emissions based on runtime, which is fine, but for fit benchmarking users, that's going to be no help at all because we already have a runtime table, so you're not going to gain any extra insight. And that's kind of demonstrated on this slide. So I've run the same set of problem minimizer pairs on Linux, where Code Carbon had access to the power consumption data, and then I've run it on Windows, where I didn't have access to the Intel Power Gadget. And so the blue stars show the results on Windows, and you can see that there's a kind of very linear relationship between runtime and emissions. So yeah, we're not kind of gaining any additional insight from that. And I mean, the fit for, or the results for Linux are also pretty much on a linear relationship, but there are a few results that kind of deviate from that line. And you can also see that when running on Windows with the kind of fallback mode, it looks like the emissions are being kind of underestimated. So yeah, it just kind of goes to show that if you don't have access to kind of accurate ways of measuring the power consumption, then you're not necessarily going to get loads of insight from Code Carbon in this case. So then kind of an example of how you maybe could get a bit more insight from having the emissions table. So with optimization algorithms, you can get kind of global and local minimizers. Global minimizers are generally more accurate at finding the true minimum of a function, but they do take longer to run. And yeah, local minimizers tend to be fast, but you can't guarantee that you'll get the minimum that you're looking for. So this is an example of an accuracy table. And so we've got a global minimizer on the end column under the SciPy Go package, and then the LMFit minimizers are also global minimizers. And you can see that for SciPy Go, we're getting kind of overall the best accuracy for this problem set. But I mean, it's kind of marginal in, well, the local minimizers do find it the solution in most cases, but there are some that it really kind of blows up and doesn't perform well at all. So that's the accuracy table. If we then have a look at the runtime table, it paints a very different picture. And you can see that the global minimizers are a lot slower than the local minimizers. And if we look at the kind of third row down in particular, the MGH10 problem, you can see that the SciPy Go minimizer is like 798 times slower than our fastest local minimizer. So yeah, it's not great. And then if we look at the emissions table, it's kind of similar to runtime, but you can see like for the MGH10 problem, the differential evolution minimizer is only 340 times less carbon efficient than the most carbon efficient local minimizer, which is kind of not as bad as you may expect based on the runtime table. I mean, it's still not great, but yeah, I guess my point is that by having the emissions table, you get that kind of extra layer of insight, and perhaps in cases, maybe not this one, where the local minimizers did perform quite well in terms of accuracy, but in other cases, having this additional insight may help you to justify that kind of trade-off between accuracy and efficiency when it comes to your problems. And then something else that I'm kind of interested in having a look into in a bit more depth is understanding whether running things in parallel is more efficient or not. So I had a go at implementing one of our fit benchmarking minimizers in parallel. So this one was a Bayesian minimizer, so it's a Markov chain Monte Carlo approach, so it's kind of easily parallelizable because it's just sampling the parameter space rather than there's no, well, it's easy to parallelize. And yeah, you can see that actually for most cases, in terms of runtime, the parallel implementation is slower, and this is probably because I was using Python multiprocessing, so there's some overheads in serializing the functions. And actually, in a lot of cases, it's worse in terms of emissions as well. But there's an interesting problem, this MISRA 1C start 2, where you can see runtime-wise, it's kind of 3.5 times slower in parallel than it is in serial. And so you might just think, oh, maybe like an email came through, or I was running Zoom or something at that time, and so that's why it's a lot slower. But actually, in terms of emissions, it's a lot lower in parallel than it is in serial. So there's kind of cases like this which would then warrant kind of further investigation. And yeah, that's something that I would like to go forward and look into a bit more. So there's a couple of examples of specifically in fit benchmarking, what users might kind of look out for in the emissions table. But more generally, how does having things like an emissions table or emissions tracking more generally help users? So carbon budgeting is a policy that's on the horizon, and so when it comes to planning projects, we'll need to start kind of budgeting for carbon like we do for staff time. And so having pieces of software that track carbon and report carbon usage to users is useful for people to be able to have a better idea of kind of what they're actually using carbon-wise when it comes to running their software. It's also good for just generally raising awareness. If every time you're running a piece of software or a piece of code, you're getting the emissions that's produced reported back to you, then it might make you think twice about kind of just running things over and over again. And then, yeah, if we're using carbon emissions as a metric for deciding or like measuring performance and deciding which minimizers to use in the case of benchmarking, then that provides some motivation for developers and software engineers to produce more carbon efficient solvers. So in terms of next steps, there are a few things I'd like to do to kind of carry on this work. So I'd like to add some examples and case studies to the fit benchmarking documentation to sort of illustrate how an emissions table is useful and give people ideas for how to use it. I'd also like to improve the results table outputs that we get from fit benchmarking. So yeah, you may have kind of picked up from the fact that I haven't used large results tables in any of my slides, but the information that you get from fit benchmarking can be quite overwhelming. And in the example where I looked at the global and local minimizers, having 3 separate tables is quite difficult to then kind of digest that information and draw conclusions from it. We do have an existing table which has runtime and accuracy on the same table to make it easier to compare them, but that doesn't include emissions at the moment, so I'd like to at least be able to toggle between the different metrics so you can look at 2 on the same table. And I'm also interested in looking into other ways that the results tables can be improved more generally. And then finally, I'd like to investigate a bit further into the efficiency of running things in parallel and kind of looking at that trade-off between carbon efficiency and improved performance. Yeah, so that's all I had to say. Thank you very much for listening. And then, yeah, I've got kind of a references slide at the end with links to the tools that I mentioned earlier on. So I think those are available through one of the apps that has the talks. So yeah, thank you for listening, and yeah, happy to answer any questions.
Great, thank you. So we definitely have some questions. Let's see, there's Actually, a couple that Andy and I asked that are kind of similar that I'll try to combine, which is what kinds of hardware are you actually measuring? Is it CPU, GPU, memory, networking, disk?
So I've been measuring on CPU. So yeah, just kind of locally on my laptop.
Okay. I mean, I guess maybe just as a quick follow-up, does that, can you say that that's the right thing to do? Is it worth looking at other things as well?
Yeah, I think I'd like to look at other things in the future, but haven't done yet.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Let's see. Question. Do you consider how many initial guesses you want or need for the different algorithms?
That's not something I've thought about yet, but again, yeah, it's something I could think about going forward. Yeah.
Okay. So how do you decide, I guess really how does a user decide how important runtime versus accuracy versus carbon is? Like if you have
I
all
guess
these...
that's dependent on what the user's looking for and what the application is for their problem. So it's not something that when you use fit benchmarking, it's kind of enforced what you should be prioritizing. So yeah, it's down to the user.
Okay. How does the scale of emitted carbon compare to the embedded carbon of the system?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, yeah, it's tiny really compared to the embedded carbon, but I think that yeah, I mean, all of the results that I've shown in the talk, the carbon emissions look really tiny, but I guess the idea is like these problems are going to be run many, like hundreds or thousands of times by scientists. So it's then how that scales up, and small changes, yeah, will have a more of an impact, I guess, when they're run a lot of times. But yeah, embedded carbon is yeah, a big problem that is arguably, well, it's a different issue, I think, to running the software.
Okay. What sort of response has there been from the research community about including carbon emissions of your software? Are they interested, or are they more? Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, that's a good question. I think we haven't really interacted much with the users of fit benchmarking around kind of whether it is something that they use or something that they're interested in using. I think that initially, so a talk about fit benchmarking was given at a workshop a couple of years ago, and I think that's where the initial idea came from for introducing an emissions table, because it was kind of noted that that would be something interesting to have. But yeah, since we've actually implemented it, I've not heard from many of the users about whether it's actually used.
Okay. How tied does this work to fitting specifically? How hard would it be to apply to other kinds of data analysis that users would be doing?
Oh, I think the code carbon is kind of independent of application. So yeah, it's really easy to add to kind of any data analysis or any piece of software that you're running.
From the perspective of reducing emissions, how would you decide whether to use HPC, cloud, or personal computer for a particular problem? Is that something you've thought about?
Yeah, again, that's not something that I've looked at in depth yet, but would be interested in finding more about. Yeah, hopefully with like emissions tracking tools like Code Carbon, that will be easier to do. But yeah, it's not something I've looked in depth into at the moment.
Okay. Let's see, a question that maybe you've already answered in the talk, but is this running on CPU only? Is the algorithm parallelized? So that's...
Yeah, so it's CPU only at the moment, but again, I'd like to look into different, using kind of GPU in the future. And yeah, there was the one kind of parallel implementation that I've looked at so far, but again, I'd like to look at parallelizing different minimizers and yeah, seeing how that affects things.
Let's see, really interesting work. Besides runtime and emissions, does fit benchmarking also report energy usage, sort of a location agnostic proxy for emissions?
So no, it doesn't report energy usage at the moment, but again, that's something that, yeah, I'd be interested in looking at extending it to in the future.
Let's see, a few more. Would it not be more impactful to put an actual price tag in some currency rather than carbon emissions?
Yeah, I mean, I think, yeah, that's an interesting concept. I think, yeah, I suppose maybe you'd get more people interested if it was an actual cost rather than carbon cost. But I think it's important that it's highlighted that it's kind of, well, yeah, there's an actual carbon cost as well, not just a monetary cost to kind of running things.
Okay, sorry, we're getting lots of questions, and the old ones are not getting taken off my, my list, so it's a little bit hard for me to track where we are, but I think, let's see, are there benefits to embedding energy usage measuring in the software package versus measuring energy usage by a package via an external tool or package?
So I think that the benefit to embedding the energy usage measurement into the software package means that it's just like, there's no extra step for users to have to kind of look at that separately and using an external tool. And I mean, yeah, like Code Carbon is an external package that I've then just added into fit benchmarking. So there's, yeah, it depends what you're looking to do. And I think for fit benchmarking, because we want to add the emissions table and report that to users as part of the fit benchmarking output, it's important that it's been embedded into the software package, because otherwise we wouldn't be able to report it.
Let's see, so two questions that are kind of similar. Basically, how do you handle the case where renewable energy is used?
That's a good question. I think, so in terms of the source of energy and like kind of what energy grid is being looked at by Code, that's all kind of handled by Code Carbon, and there's information on the methodology that they use in their documentation. So that's not something that we've looked into ourselves on this project. But yeah, it's kind of, the information is there via the Code Carbon documentation.
Okay. So we'll do one more,
Okay.
which is, could the emissions be reduced if the software is written in a compiled language with more natural parallelization than using Python?
Yes, probably. Yeah.
But would the trade-off be worthwhile?
Again, that's something that I haven't investigated, but yeah, all of these things are like, yeah, I think this is at the very kind of early stages of sort of, I've written an implementation for it, but haven't been able to sort of explore in the full sense yet. So yeah, all of these are great ideas, and I would like to look into them.